Hi, Tahir Carl Karmali.
Hi, how's it going?
Hi, it's going well. We're letting folks into your live artist talk hosted by Artfare Curator at Artfare and Carolina Wheat. And I'm really excited that we'll be speaking to Tahir Carl Karmali today. As we kind of move through the Zoom land and admitting everyone, people are still waiting. I'd love to remind everyone to please turn your mute button on so the screen can be predominantly clear. And we'll be recording this tonight. So make sure everyone's mute is on in the lower left-hand corner. Megan Young, I'm talking to you. Okay, great. Wonderful. Tahir, it is such a pleasure to have you tonight for our weekly series of artists talks and studio visits in the virtual realm during the plague or the pandemic. You come really well received in relationship to not only your highly crafted and conceptual work, speaking to immigration, very personal narratives of colonialism and neocolonialism, relationship to our own consumptive behaviors. Looking forward to hearing more about those processes and concepts that without further ado, you've shown at Rachel Uffner, Pioneer Works, High Art Museum. There are a handful of opportunities that you've had internationally, and you received your master's degree from SVA, I understand, in digital photography. And of course, if there's anything, I know I'm forgetting a lot of stuff, but we're really happy to have you here today, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I think you hit all the points. You make me sound very fancy. Definitely don't think of myself that way, but yeah, that was amazing.
Well, I forgot to mention that you were born just outside Nairobi, Kenya, and so you yourself are an immigrant to the United States, and I think it's a nice kind of, starting point to some of your extremely personal work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was born in Nairobi in the 80s. I don't know why that came to mind. Interestingly enough, a friend of mine was talking to me about they talk about the BCG injections, and like people who have certain BCG injections aren't hit by COVID as serious enough. And I was like, just remembered, for some reason, thought about like the scar that's left by the BCG injection that's like on my arm over here. I don't know why I just thought about that. I'm sorry. That's just completely random.
Well, just explain a little bit more for folks who don't know what the BCG injection is. I do know that it's quite a scar.
Yeah, it's like for, I think it's for TB. And it has this sort of like weird sort of like floral scar in a way that just kind of appears on your skin. I don't know why I thought about that.
And have you been reading? I love this is a tidbit we wouldn't normally have gotten out of a bio. Come on,
right?
This is supposed to help be more provide more immunization towards COVID-19. I
don't know. There was like some sort of like informal study that was done in Portugal, apparently, that people who have had a certain type of BCG injection face like less, but it's in less like symptoms and are more prone to like getting cured from the virus. So yeah, I mean, first off, like at the beginning of this whole thing, I got really sick for 2 weeks. So I haven't gotten did the test to see whether I actually had it, but I've never been that sick and lost like my sense of taste and smell ever. So I'm convinced that I have it. And then obviously, like, I really wanted to find that out and then sort of donate blood. But as you know, we are not allowed to donate blood as queer individuals, which is a big problem. But yeah, I just wanted to bring light to that as well. And it's just something that really needs to be changed about, you know, how we, because it's shameful that, like, you know, the idea of donating blood from queer men and women is sort of, I think it's mostly just men, right? Or is it also, yeah?
Yes, they ask every or every person that wants to donate blood, have you had sex with a gay male or gay male sex? It's part of the questionnaire for donating blood. So I don't think, as a queer woman myself, that I would be subject to, since it's been a minute since I've had queer sex with a gay man. So nonetheless, one of the things that I really appreciate are the newer works you're doing with the copper, the blood and metal, and, you know, kind of on the tip of COVID potentially being preventative. Drinking water out of copper has been something in an Ayurvedic understanding for many, many years, centuries, not. And these works that you've created that are very nicely priced, that we just launched on Artfare.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about those, or shall we just kind of move straight into?
We move into the pre-prepared slideshow.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I prepared a slideshow today. So yeah, I mean, I have had a really interesting relationship to materials and sort of like processing them. And I was interested, you know, in byproducts from specific projects. And one of the byproducts from one of my projects was copper. And I actually had quite a lot of copper because I was actually extracting the cobalt from the cell phone batteries. And I was looking at, let me just go to the next slide. So I was extracting the cobalt from cell phone batteries, and I was looking at how cobalt was being used and was mined and so on. And so because of this, I have a lot of copper left over. And I decided that with this copper, you know, a lot of people, a lot of those pieces, you know, a lot of people were telling me that, you know, they really enjoy them. And I wanted to make something that was sort of, you know, encapsulates my practice, but in a really easy and potable and like transferable manner, instead of like, you know, having these like large scale like installations or these like large scale like textile pieces. And so this, as a result, I oxidized the copper, which there we go. So I oxidized the copper, which basically creates this sort of like teal color, this almost Tiffany blue color. And you can kind of like manage how this color has come up. And kind of because the cobalt is also on the copper as well. So there is a little bit and flecks and tiny little bits and pieces of cobalt and lithium on there. And the sort of oxidization process kind of happens inside these jars, that kind of you have to sort of make filings out of these bits of copper and then oxidize it with vinegar and salt. And so by kind of like managing, like I wanted it to still feel a little bit sculptural in a way, and I still wanted there to be like this level of texture. So a lot of what I did was add like a lot of salt or a lot of like certain byproducts, so that when the ink dries, it starts to crystallize and it starts to actually take on multiple textures. And I think you can see it better in you know, in like sort of like the larger paintbrush strokes that you see. And also just sort of really working with a material that's sort of so readily available in the studio, and then you just sort of like place it onto the paper so that people can kind of understand how the practice unfolds, you know, with just, you know, simple brushstrokes. So the series is called Blood is Metal, which really kind of also is an offshoot and like concept that I talk about with my paperwork series, which is sort of this notion of like, I don't know how to explain it, but like I often think of like blood as a type of metal because of the iron content that, you know, we have. And I also think about sort of like, you know, what are sort of social lubricants, and especially in terms of like right now and, you know, contemporary times. I don't know how to say this word, contemporary times. You know, the cell phone really plays a huge role in how business and trading and communications and relationships and all facets of like your life are kind of controlled through this central device. And it's something that we keep really close to us. It's something that, you know, is like next to your bedside table. It's something that's in your pocket. It's something that's with you. It's almost like an appendage. And so I thought of like, you know, this kind of turning of this material into a liquid kind of reminds me of like, you know, like this sort of like reverse, you know, it's interesting how the material as from this solid state of like copper, as it oxidizes in and then turns into this liquid, it's kind of like the opposite of like blood, where it's sort of like when it oxidizes, when our blood oxidizes, it sort of turns into like scabs, or like it turns into like a solid material. So kind of like likening these two materials.
To hear it's fascinating. Well, you would use the word scab, but there's also this residual aspect you're talking about, the crystallization of the salt, the kind of splotchy, almost relief remnants that you have on the paper as the cobalt is not really disintegrating with the oxidation of the copper. You know, these two things combine as you're speaking, and, you know, seeing some of these strokes turn into the drapes of the installations that I've seen in other iterations of your work. I also am curious, perhaps others are too, the copper also stands in this wonderful patina color, this verdigris. It's the Statue of Liberty's colors. It's my favorite lady of all time, minus my wife and daughter. But, you know, to think about the Statue of Liberty in relationship to some of the work in your concept, you spoke of the mines, and, you know, whether it's the cobalt mines mining and the lithium battery mines. Can you speak a little bit to that?
So with regards to like the mining process, so basically where I started to do a lot of research, and actually I stumbled upon this video. This is actually a great slide to sort of look at it. It's really interesting, actually, when I make these paintings, sometimes there's like nothing else for me to paint outside of exploring the paintbrush and allowing the material to happen. But then I also just paint the sculptures that are like right in front of me. So sometimes like some of the paintings are like representations or like aspects or like little bits and pieces of sculptures that I've made that are still hanging in the studio. And so this particular one, I guess on your left-hand side, is actually a facsimile of the very first strata piece, which is sort of made from the cell phone battery, like the cobalt from the cell phone batteries, and then the byproduct, and also a little bit of lithium. And I got interested in this because I was watching these videos about how cobalt mining actually happens. And it was sort of this thing where it's kind of like, you know, it was like one of these videos that I started like watching, and it kind of like about how terrible, you know, Elon Musk is, and just, you know, I don't have a very good relationship with the idea of Elon Musk. I'm sorry if anyone is a really big fan of his. But it was sort of this like where Tesla gets their batteries from, you know, and like where Apple gets their batteries from, and like, all of this kind of stuff. And then obviously that kind of came, it comes from these sort of minds, and it comes from these spaces where, you know, a lot of people are being pushed out of their ancestral land or their cultural land and so on. And the same thing with like lithium in South America, and also here in parts of and the parts of the United States that, you know, lithium taps and like lithium is actually acquired. But for the purposes of my research, and like what I ended up stumbling upon was this interview of these children that were children like who are sort of small enough to fit down these like really thin mines, and these kind of it's really interesting because like what the mines look like are almost like these kind of like, you know, if you put your fingers in like dough or in mud, or like, you know, when you like kind of do this to like focaccia, sorry, but like, you know, like all of this kind of thing, so it looks kind of really like modeled like scabs, like almost like a little bit like pimples on the landscape, you know, like sort of thing. And I started to get into sort of, you know, watching these interviews and seeing what reporters are, you know, like recording. And what struck me was that one of the interviews and like the children, the language that were speaking was Swahili, and like that's something that I grew up listening to and I understood. And, you know, a lot of the time when you watch videos or you watch like news reports about, you know, what's going on in like a foreign country or anything like that, like the language differentiation kind of like separates you. And so you're reading like the subtitles. And so because it ended up being these sort of, it ended up being in Swahili, and it kind of hit me in a very different way from like if I was to watch anything else. And yeah, let's move on to look at like the Strata series. So this is actually the Strata series. This is the very first one that I had made. And the cobalt actually oxidizes when it turns into the dye. It oxidizes green. And so a lot of my work, you know, at this point in my career and practice was kind of like about acquiring a material that, you know, has this sort of like historical or like this contemporary relevance to what's happening today, that perpetuates like neocolonialism, you know, late stage capitalism, and like things that are sort of like engineered for a certain demographic of people. So like definitely like cell phones and like smartphones and Tesla cars and so on. And so I wanted to take this material, which I actually acquire from cell phone batteries, actually opening them up and then scraping out the cobalt, which is actually adhered onto the copper somehow.
I really appreciate it's almost like a reversal of mining, you know, like a upcycle or recycling. The color also is a little bit more drab than the oxidization of the copper. So you can really get a feeling for it. But I'm just curious, are you protecting yourself when you're scraping, you know, what kind of protective gear are you wearing? Or is it a danger for you to be scraping away these lithium batteries to create your work?
Yeah, it's dangerous. Don't do that. I do not suggest anybody do that. I actually had heavy metal, I actually had heavy metal, like a small, like I had heavy metal poisoning, like not like in a severe way, but actually a lot of like artists actually suffer from heavy metal poisoning. And so I had like a little bit of joint pain, constant dehydration, and like these headaches. And then I ended up kind of being very lost motivation in when I was doing some of these works. But I kind of like, one of my friends, Joseph Buckley, was like, can you be more safe and stop like, and it was really funny because I was actually doing this in Pioneer Works. And I didn't have any protection. Like people and they have the Open Studios program. It was a mess. So there was all of this kind of like, you have to sort of be really careful with the material. And I learned my lesson for sure. But at the same time, you also think about the people who are mining these heavy metals, right? And, a lot of potters and ceramicists suffer from heavy metal poisoning because of the glazes that they use. So I didn't feel too terrified for my life, but I definitely sort of felt like, I can understand how this can really impact someone's body.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a conversation for another day, and it just almost feels a little performative.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not intentionally so, yet you're kind of reclaiming some of this poison, almost subjecting yourself to make the work about the poisoning of the work. I mean, it's very meta to hear. But, can you talk to us a little bit about your formations and these folding raffia paintings that, works? How did you discover the presentation of the works, and where do you come, you're using these materials to somehow pigment the raffia and the paper, yet where are you coming from in relation to its presentation and installation?
I think firstly, when you see the 2D versions, very flat versions, and then there are these other versions which are sort of like more sort of like bulbous and billowy, sort of like drapery of fabric. The choice of the raffia and that material itself was because, like a lot to do with my practice is like very deliberate with like how materials are chosen. And like why I choose certain materials. And so the cloth, the raffia, is actually Kuba cloth, which, we think about Kuba cloth with regards to these like really beautiful, like it was like modernism before like Europe found out about like really got into like modernism. And they're like these really beautiful, and so like you see them everywhere, and like you see like Kuba cloth kind of used as decorative items. You see Kuba cloth used as these framed objects, and they are like these like very beautiful like Congolese works of art. And I wanted to sort of take this material and like stain it with the cobalt and kind of talk, and then for the Kuba cloth as a carrier material for the cobalt to also kind of propel like the narrative and this idea of like displacement and this idea of like whatever, and like there are bits and pieces of like with the copper that I harken back to or reference like modernist aesthetics. And then also kind of bringing in this sort of like material sort of like exploration, these abstractions that come from like natural formations of material and like landscape and land and so on. And so there is this kind of like tension, but like definitely with the sacks and like these kind of like, I wanted it to feel like it's almost like on a body, that it's almost like, it's like something that's being carried, something that's being held, something that really like has weight and like presence in a space. Like, so it doesn't actually just sort of flat and like sit against the wall, like patiently, like, behaviorally. And, the title Strata as well kind of talks about sort of the striation that happens within the dye patterns that I create, which is sort of like this sort of sediment dye kind of pattern. And so this kind of like reminds me of like rock patterns, or like it reminds me of like the cross section of rock. And so that's why I kind of use like strata as a metaphor, not only for kind of repeated history or ideas about repetition in sort of like sediments or like the movement of land and so on. And so that's kind of like where the aesthetics of it came from. And it's sort of like partially like, this sort of like intuitive formal decisions while making. So, you know, you take like certain ideas and you kind of keep them in one place, and then you sort of like intuitively put things together. And there's definitely one of the things, and I think one of the things about my work is that there's a lot of planning, and it is incredibly like contrived to an extent that like I need there to be space for for the art and the craft to happen. And so like, you know, definitely the process of merging these two things and these two materials, and like talking about these particular narratives, and like, you know, using cell phone batteries from the United States and using these sort of like Kuba cloth. And like, this cloth that you are looking at are the actual cloths that are made by the Kuba people. I actually commissioned 2 villages to actually make these specific sized raffia pieces for me. And so on one hand, there's this kind of like very intimate sort of like trading with a village, and like with you know, people who have this cultural history to this textile. And then at the other hand, it's sort of like getting dead batteries off eBay, you know, from the United States. And so like, it's really important to kind of, I think like a lot of the time people want to put this work as like, this is about like Africa, but it's not necessarily about Africa. It's about the world. It's about this kind of like globalist sort of like ecosystem that we're all like co-signed onto. So, you know, it's kind of like a negotiation of like, what part of the aesthetics do you want to discuss as African? What part of the aesthetic do you want to discuss as being like American? And definitely like what stains the fabric are the batteries that I attain from the United States.
Well, in some ways it's so literal, in other ways it's so ironic that, you know, to have these fabrics draped with the stain, and as you even call it, blood,
Yeah.
of, you know, this hyper globalization within the realm of telecommunications, the Zoom, what we're doing right now, and being able to stay separate yet together online. Would you go back one slide? You had 3 these fantastic, really hangings. Yes, these 3 children stand and lay in the soil, 2018. This work is just so compelling too. You mentioned, for me and maybe other viewers that are watching, it's kind of haunting in a way. Feels like a sarcophagus or some sort of shrouded body, dead body. You're, whether it was intentional or like it's so literal, your intuition brings this work to the forefront. You're speaking about the pain and suffering of folks that are mining this material. And as you're also mining it yourself, I have a question from CM Kubrick that asks, do you use protective gear now?
Yes. I do. I do try to, and I want to do that. I think with regards to protective gear, there are certain times where, yes, I do it. I wear the mask, which, interestingly enough, the same mask that I use to protect myself from like heavy metal poisoning is what I'm using now for to go outside. So I look like this weird like space machine. But also the shrouds, the 3 children stand and lay in the soil. So I was creating these sort of, I had these smaller swatches of like of the textile, and I was dyeing these, and I was like kind of putting them together, and I started joining them together, and I started sort of like playing around with like, okay, formally, how could this work? You know, like, does this, you know, like, how will it drape? And these are actually sort of like a much stiffer raffia textile. And so from this, I was able to sort of like sculpt and create something that was a little bit more, I guess, yes, literal. Like they are representations of, like the body and shrouds. And so I was thinking about, actually like, inflating the fabric and the textile to kind of show these like appendages. Like, and so like in parts you can see, especially the one on the left was when I was really thinking about like appendages, and there are parts of it that look like that, and bits and pieces of body. And then also like I started to also think about, weirdly enough, like architecture, and I started thinking about buildings as well. And so it's really like a mix of like a lot of different forms that I'm putting together, that I'm like keeping in my mind, and then sort of like intuitively sort of like formally making these works, because again, like I didn't want to make like a literal body like hanging on the wall. I think that's it wasn't something that the series really needed. And I think that using the talking about this particular topic, it kind of requires, for me, it required this sort of it required somebody to just want to know more about it, and sort of things that are a little bit more inquisitive, so that, if you see something like a body kind of like, you kind of don't want to, you kind of get it already, kind of without needing to looking at the wall text. But I wanted it to be sort of something that you would have to like flip flop and decide between, what it is. Yeah, I really enjoyed making these particular works. I made them at Triangle in Dumbo, which also is kind of this space where there are a lot of like tech startups at the same time. So it was a really interesting experience, kind of like, dealing with this material and this matter and these subjects, and then also sort of like going for lunch in Dumbo and like seeing sort of like all of these like sort of young startups and like tech companies kind of infiltrate and sort of like take over parts of Dumbo as the artists are sort of like moving out now. So there are all these kind of like weird moments that all of these things are happening while I'm making these works,
Yeah, these strata works are really fantastic. As you hang them on dowels and on white walls. Oh, I sense a breakaway.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, when you put your slideshow down just for a little bit, how you're functioning right now. Tahir, can you pull your slideshow down or stop sharing your screen so we can just see you for a minute while we have this little break from the screen?
Here we are.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just wondering, your work is pretty industrial, although, again, he's got this really oxymoronic kind of fun things. It's also like fabric and free flowing and, one love. But I wonder, where are you working right now? And do you have a space to create larger scale works, or are you just kind of buckling down with these smaller works?
Well, I definitely have enjoyed, having access to making smaller works, especially with the Blood as Metal series. And I've actually been spending a lot of time doing mostly like research, and mostly like catching up with artists back home. And like this Zoom reality allows me to sort of like be like, oh, well, you're home anyways, so I can just contact you whenever I want. You know what I mean? Like, and like not whenever I want necessarily, but like I can, we can have conversations. We can have like these cross-border, cross like time. It's sort of it's really interesting how this works. So I've actually been spending a lot of time kind of like catching up with people, and actually being able to meet with people that I typically wouldn't be able to sort of like immediately meet with, which is really interesting. where it's sort of like now, instead of like worrying about a meeting with someone kind of like going to a specific location, I can be like, we can meet on Zoom. And like that kind of very small gesture allows people to sort of like have more conversations about certain things that you typically wouldn't actually have, and having these pointed conversations. And then, so this has actually allowed me to do a lot of research as well with, you know, I have like 4 projects in process right now, and like really excited about all of them. I hope that like they can come into sort of like fruition, you know, within the next two years. But the most immediate project that we're working on with a collective that I work with called Thought, which, if we're talking about technology, you know, from sort of the Strata series, Thought is actually like the other aspect of like, you know, looking at this supply chain and sort of like more kind of on what is the reality of tech funding, you know, and like how do people get tech funding. And so it's kind of centered around, so I work with Mira Venio and Elizabeth Tice, who are really close friends of mine. And so we've been sort of like workshopping and making all of these things kind of happen. And it's like really exciting. And there's some exciting news about that that I will eventually tell you guys about.
That's awesome. But you were mentioning that you were thinking about borders, you know, and accessibility between folks right now. And I know we mentioned it earlier, yet the paperwork series, you know, does deal with immigration and the amount of bureaucracy that we are stunted by. I mean, it's just to get legal status.
Yeah.
And I was hoping that we could maybe look at a little bit of that work.
Are we going into the next part of the slideshow?
Yes, and I mean, unless you have it, please, unless you have other things you want to kind of talk about in terms of immigration and the relationship to borders and landscape.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I think like, you know, also like while I've been sort of in this, you know, space, I've actually had time to kind of go back on certain readings. And I'm actually sort of like rereading, you know, Robert Smithson and Nancy Holt, and kind of, you know, they've actually been releasing these videos on Vimeo of you know, footage that you haven't seen, of their discussions of like all of this kind of stuff, which has been incredibly inspiring. So I've been kind of going back and like looking at sort of like these ideas around like landscape, ideas around entropy and so on. And, you know, a lot of my work, my paperwork is very much kind of sort of like, as my paperwork series evolved, has been inspired by this. And so, yeah, and that it's really about sort of like ideas around landscape and access. And, you know, it's sort of hard to read Robert Smithson and some of these artists that make these discussions about landscape without me thinking about my nationality and without me thinking about, am I allowed in these spaces? And what actually prevents me from going to these spaces. So actually over the past year, I've actually been making a point to actually go to like, you know, Spiral Jetty, and to go to Double Negative, and to go to like these spaces where it's sort of like, typically, you know, if I would not actually have access to these spaces without filling out a shit ton of paperwork, period. But then also it's sort of like, like kind of like resolving these ideas around the concept of land ownership, borders, and so on, you know. And so I think we can actually go into sort of the paperwork series. Here it is. Here we go. So title. Here. And so this is actually sort of like an installation that I did at the International Print Center in New York, where you're actually only seeing like 102 sheets of handmade paper. And so my sheets of paper that I make by hand. I actually started this whole process at Brick. I applied for the Brick summer residency. I think you're seeing a trend with like my career. It's like residency hopping pretty much in the United States. And like I'm so thankful for the Brick residency in specific, because like, it was my very first residency in the United States. And they kind of gave me a space to sort of like really experiment and like just sort of, something that I really didn't have in the United States, because I just finished my master's. And I was on my optional professional training, which is your OPT, which is after you leave your master's, you have 1 year of like doing your exploring your practice, or like working somewhere. And so what I ended up doing is going to residencies, and like I really wanted to, so at Brick was kind of this first time where I actually had to sort of like reconcile with this idea that like my time here is temporary, and I need to make the most of it and like figure out what I'm figure out this project. And so initially the project was sort of a discussion about sort of my great grandfather's migration from North India to Kenya in the 1890s, right? And so initially it was a lot to do with sort of the British Kenyan colonial history. But at the same time, I saw myself kind of going through this paperwork process of like having to sort of, legitimize, or like this bureaucratic process of like legitimize myself as a person that is allowed to be in a specific space or in a landscape. And so I ended up working on this series sort of in tandem with these notions of like the British East Africa history, British East Africa, and like sort of this British colonial history and the empires. So it's almost sort of like you're looking at like 100 years of like history. So like all the way from like the 1890s all the way to like 2000 and I think it was 2015 or 16. Anyway, so I ended up working on this series and making these individual sheets of paper out of my visa application documents and like photocopies of all of these documents. And then also during the residency, I had to apply for my artist visa so that I could stay another few years here in the United States to practice. And then this kind of started to compile. And so you start to see these, all of these different kind of concepts and ideas about, firstly, like negotiating ideas around, your ancestral like history, my contemporary, like my contemporary identity with regards to paperwork. And so all of these things started to sort of meld together. And so it kind of talks about, again, this sort of like repeated history, repeated actions. It's sort of like something that looks different, but is actually kind of like the same, and sort of like this border negotiation and like bureaucracy, right? Yeah.
Did you take the original papers and blend them up to create the pulp and add water? Did you photocopy them?
Some of them have like the original like visa application documents, and some of them, but most of them are sort of like photocopies. And obviously I wanted to use photocopies because there is a kind of relationship that an immigrant has to a photocopier that is profound and deep. And I think like, it is important, and I really understand sort of like the importance of sort of like the trueness of the paper and like the authenticity of it. But then also I was, when I was in when I was doing my master's, I had to do a lot of traveling to Europe, and I had to do a little bit of traveling, a lot of traveling to Europe, and sort of like growing up and sort of going to different places, there is this kind of thing that you have to do when you apply for your visas or when you ask to cross borders, is that you have to photocopy a lot of documents in like in triplicate, right? And so that's anything ranging from your bank statements to your birth certificate to like all sorts of like documents, like employee letter of employment to former visa documents. So it's just like a lot of documents. And so you're basically like sitting in front of a photocopier, just like photocopying all the time. And the same thing, you know, with when I was doing my OPT visa and my O1 visa, it's this kind of relationship that you have to. So I didn't really feel so bad that I was using this photocopier. Also, I was in residence, I was at like St. Anne's School, and there was like a photocopier right there as well. And like, just sort of like, you know, had the opportunity to sort of like photocopy and just like make a lot of these works and test so much, which I really kind of enjoyed. Yeah.
That's great. And the landscape and the paperwork that you showed in the previous slide to this one really assembles the story in a almost narrative fashion. And here's the Strong Room exhibition, which can, please let us know a little bit more about the material you're using here and some of this really fantastic abstraction that's got this fantastic translucency in this space.
Yeah, so I think like, you know, what had happened is when I was making the sheets of paper and I started to sort of like, because the process of making paper is actually like filtering out paper from like this sort of like loose water. And so like this sort of slurry mix. And so it's sort of like you're conforming these kind of like fibers to create like the sheet of paper, right? And and so what I started to think about sort of while I was making these like hundreds of sheets, I've made probably like 300 sheets of paper, you know, and you know, I probably about like my 200th sheet of paper, it sort of struck me that it's like I'm actually filtering this paper. It's very similar to what borders do in terms of like filtering people. And this is kind of like this kind of step when you work in a craft that you can actually push it into this more like conceptual realm where it's sort of like we're actually looking at what, like, you know, we're looking at the process of filtration, right? And we're looking at the process of filtering people through like landscapes, right? And so like a border is fictitious, right? It's just a semi-permeable like idea, right? And so so you have some sheets of paper and passports that are allowed through and some that are not. And so this is sort of like the process of like filtration. And so I wanted to sort of expose this kind of like process within using the paperwork process, or the paper making process itself, and then using my own documents. So the Strong Room exhibition commission, which was one of like the most epic things that I was allowed to do, and I have to thank Kelly so much for this, because this was like kind of me realizing and being given an opportunity to realize like something that I had envisioned like in sort of like more large scale, you know, because borders are large, and you know, like this is sort of like an iteration of this kind of thing, and it's all site specific. And I really loved doing this particular one because it was in Newburgh. It was in a firehouse in Newburgh, and you know, thinking about the Hudson Valley, and then sort of the Hudson Valley history with like painting and landscape, right? And sort of being able to kind of go to this location and to be able to sort of like tell people or like portray my ideas of like how you understand and how you think about access to landscape and what different landscapes mean to different people, you know? And so, yeah, this was sort of like a really, and so the paper for this one, I was actually given my my parole, it's called, which is basically my residency parole, which is basically sort of like this 1 year that I'm allowed between visas.
That's really incredible. Can you just break it down for us for one couple minutes? The material looks like screen.
Yeah.
And then the positive space, either the negative space of the screen, which has this great translucency,
Yeah.
folded upon these 2x4s to create almost like a drying situation for film. I mean, it's just it's so analog in this fantastic way. I could talk about it for days. Yet the actual positive space, that white landscape-esque, snowy type, reminds me, is that the Pope? That's the
Yeah,
Pope.
that's the paper itself. Yeah, so that's the paper resting on top of the screen.
Right.
And these are actually the screens that you use for like mosquito, or like bug protection screens, which is kind of like, leads into like the next sculpture pretty well, because this is Isnea, which is actually made from mosquito netting, right? And so it's sort of like you think about so this is now where I'm sort of like politicizing the screen in a way where you think about immigrants and migrants as pests, or like sort of like, and this especially, beginning of 2019, and like just like 2018, United States, this sort of like not new rhetoric, but this sort of like the reemergence of this rhetoric around sort of like migrants, and like this notion that migrants are pestilent in a way. And so so this particular one is blank asylum application documents. So I actually went onto the government website to print out like tons of like asylum application documents, which are incredibly long. Asylum application, is not an easy thing to do at all, especially if you don't speak English. It's like it's a very complicated process. And this is sort of like at the time, just like, when you're thinking about sort of like the caravans coming through on the southern border, and you're thinking about sort of like all of these things that are happening, and thinking about all of the, people that are trapped in this sort of these detention centers because they just didn't fill out this paperwork, and they're considered illegal because they haven't filled out this paperwork. And so it's kind of like combining with this mosquito netting, and like kind of like having this drape and sort of like fall away, and kind of also look a little bit like a tree, or like look a little bit like fungus, look a little bit like this kind of like, this weird like little animal with like, kind of, but also in a way haunting, also in a way looks like bandages, because if you go really close, there is this sort of rust that's on there, which is something that I paired with the paperwork very quickly. When I started making these paperworks, I actually started to dry the paperwork onto rusted sheets of metal, and to kind of absorb like the iron, which kind of gives you this sort of like bloody type like dried bandage feel, which you can actually see in another Kelly commissioned piece, which is actually weirdly behind me right now. And sort of like this association with like soil, and the iron in the soil, and like the iron in the blood, and like this kind of rhetoric around blood and soil, which is like a very like Nazi, or like I forgot, white nationalist like phrase, which is sort of used a lot, where it's sort of like, the blood and the land are associated together, and therefore like this kind of rhetoric is what kind of spearheads a lot of ideas around immigrants. And so this is kind of this pairing and kind of scary and ghostly at the same time.
Yeah, and that piece was at the inaugural art fair opening where we had over 40 artists and a 4-day pop-up, and it was really well received. Incredible artists, incredible folks came out that night. Kelly Schreier is the head of Strong Room, correct?
Yes.
Yes, and she's
also works at Artfare.
Artfare team, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, and so this work is kind of like, as we can see behind you, it's aged itself. It's fantastic to see it in a different light, per se.
Yeah. And also a different form. I mean, a lot of my work's kind of like, I can actually stop the screen thing here, and then we can actually have, because that was the last slide of paperwork anyways, so.
Yeah, and we have about 5 minutes. I really want to get to Lotus.
I know. I mean, I guess we can go on a little bit longer if people are up for it. But this is actually over here kind of like a reformation of like that particular piece for my apartment, because my husband was like, you know, we need something on that wall. And so I was like, didn't trust him to pick anything good. Yeah.
I mean, this work, you had a couple commissions, and then you've had these opportunities and residencies, and your inspiration has been profoundly attached to, as we've talked about, your personal history. You talked about your present day in New York, you know, and kind of thinking about the future. There does feel like there are moments of reinvention that come across through your medium, and you know, hardcore metal elements that you're oxidizing and using as pigment in, you know, in a not so healthy way. So stay safe. But then also, you know, your textiles and installations. And what are you thinking about right now? I mean, what is, and
next? Yeah, I think, like, you know, when you, let me share my screen so people can look a little bit at Lotus before we kind of like go into,
yes, please
so
do.
they can understand kind of like where it's going. So Lotus is basically like this sculpture that was commissioned by The Shed, which is a new commissioning agency in New York. And this is sort of like using so a lot of my practice is about sort of like taking a specific material, a political material, and then putting it into this sort of like formalist understanding, and sort of like in the same kind of like vein as, you know, I'm inspired by, you know, Elena Tsui and Teresa Margolles and Ibrahim Mahama, and Mona Khatoum. There's so many artists, mostly actually female. And, you know, like, the thing is like, I wanted to sort of start talking about things that didn't necessarily have materials attached to it. That is like, so like, oh, I know that material, or like, yes, paperwork is about paper, strata is about cobalt, and, you know, these works are very much about something. And so now kind of moving into sort of thinking about design vernaculars, and sort of like, as, you know, I'm a professor of design at Brooklyn College, and sort of now moving on with my career and kind of like diving into design vernaculars has allowed me to sort of open a whole other chapter to my practice, to sort of now look at sort of like deliberate formal decisions that are made with regards to design, and especially design decisions that are used for in places where people are oppressed. And so not necessarily, well, oppressed, or like, and especially things that are surrounding migrants. So in China, you know, they have these sort of like suicide prevention nettings outside the dormitories of the cell phone factories. And so Lotus is kind of inspired by this poem by Xi Liqi, and he he wrote about this sort of experience of like being lonely and being sort of isolated and sort of like, you know, working in these factories day in and day out, and then how people end up sort of like committing suicide. And it really interested me because I was really kind of focused very much on like the acquisition of cobalt and like that neocolonial history, right? And so not neocolonial history, but like this sort of like neocolonial sort of acquisition of like material from Africa. And then I started to follow the supply chain of like how are phones kind of like made, and how is this entire, what is actually shaping the world that we are, and what is this sort of like dynamic of like this upstairs and downstairs sort of culture that we're living in. And so I sort of used the vernacular of the design vernacular of the suicide nets, and reformed that suicide prevention nets and reform that into sort of a lotus. So like this opening flower, and sort of like using the lotus as a symbol, you know, for, you know, it's associated with like enlightenment, but it's also discusses sort of ideas around emerging from soil and emerging from like, you know, something really dark and deep and like a surface that we can't see. And so which is basically what a cell phone is, right? A cell phone is something that we receive it, it's clean, it's shiny, it's beautiful, it loves you, it reflects you, it's everything that, you know, you like need to operate in this kind of contemporary lifestyle. But the reality is that it comes from this very sort of, it's unearthed from, quite literally and metaphorically, from these very murky and dark spaces. And so that's kind of where the lotus sort of came from. And now moving on to sort of like my sort of contemporary sort of my next stage of what I'm looking at is sort of seeing how these systems and the design vernaculars that are associated with these systems that keep people sort of in the soil.
Well, okay, that's big. When you were thinking about the lotus, just to back up real quickly, did you think about, I understand that PRC is, you know, not exactly advocating for any belief systems like Buddhism and otherwise, but did you consider at all the lotus being part of the Eightfold Path, or understanding that its symbolism within Buddhism?
Yes, I mean, the lotus is something, so the lotus is definitely something that I have encountered quite often, you know, growing up in a, you know, I grew up in Kenya, and sort of, it's, as like a mixed race kid in Kenya, you know, like you kind of like grew up in these sort of like multi spaces, but one of the spaces that, you know, I would enter as like the Oshwal Center, which is kind of the sort of the Jain religion space, which is not necessarily similar. It's not similar to Buddhism anyways, but they're not necessarily that different from each other in terms of like the ideas around spirituality. And so like the lotus is something that I have sort of seen throughout my life and have experienced throughout. And I just sort of like gravitated to this metaphor, and I did look at a lot of historic and cultural relationships to the lotus, for sure, especially when it comes to Buddhism, which is, you know, it's associated with enlightenment. You know, it's associated with sort of like access to enlightenment, and in Hinduism as well, it is sort of you know, associated with these ideas. But then at the same time, you know, I also think about sort of like the lotus and the structure of the lotus in reference to also Islam, with regards to like it's 555, right, and 3, and sort of like the Islamic geometry as well is sort of like is part of like this thing. And there is like a vein of, you know, because I'm born and raised Muslim, so there is a vein of like Islam and like reference to Islam like throughout my practice.
That's so wonderful. Really dive deeper into your practice and to hear some of the profoundly personal things. As I've said, I know a couple times, I don't mean to sound like a broken record over here yet. It's your work is so heartfelt and so considerate and just thoughtful, and it branches out beyond your own view of life. You are inclusive and represent individuals that can't speak for themselves a lot of time. And yeah, it's just really fantastic to hear more in depth about your ideas. And a lot of times the work can hang on the wall and folks bypass the wall text on vinyl, right? Yet this opportunity to hear more about what you're doing, what you've done, where you're going. I guess just the last couple of minutes, we're already 6 minutes over.
I feel so sorry I'm sorry that I'm talking so much, guys.
I know I think I can speak for others to really reflect on the fact that we learned a lot. And
well, our pre-interview was 2 hours long, just to like give everyone like an idea of what happened.
I've been a big fan of your work as well, and just kind of like this last thought of you're talking about the next projects, which feel so extremely large, and you need a great group of community in order to kind of enact this. Can you just encapsulate that and we'll say goodnight?
With with the elevator. So basically, elevator, which I'm really excited about. I don't know if I'm allowed to tell anyone just as yet when it's going to like come out. Definitely a preview of it will come out in September, end of September. So I hope everyone's really like, is available and we can actually go outside, but there's also going to be perhaps a digital version of it. So it's basically it's a group of it's based off of like pitches, and like the idea of like the pitch tech pitches, and sort of like the idea of like the ask for money. And so I'm working with Mia Ravena, who is an experimental film director, experimental theater and film director, and Elizabeth Tice, who's a really close friend of mine, who is design at IDEO. And we were working in pitches and coming up with these ideas of like, working in the tech world. And I also have a history working in the tech world, and this idea of like how money is acquired and like how ideas are like transmitted. And so we use sort of like the format of the pitch, of like the ask for money, for the ask for like the product, right? Or like how things can be monetized and so on. But it's kind of like extrapolated, and it turns into this like crazy idea of like how far tech can actually be invasive and crazy, and like how the theories around what they're trying to produce are quite immediate and like are happening straight away. And so it's sort of like, there is if you go to thought.us, that's thoughthought.us, you can see a video, like a video preview of it, with me and myself performing a part of like the monologue. So it's kind of like we turned the pitch into this very long 15-minute poem that is going to be performed by, initially we're going to test it with 3 people, but our vision is to actually have it with like 15 people performing this sort of like, chorus of like craziness, and it's going to get very emotional, and it gets very scary at a point, when you actually realize how this entire network actually operates. And so when you actually, so if you start off like, if you go through my practice, you start off in the ground, with the cobalt, and you follow that to the factory, and then you follow that to the United States, and then you follow that, you start to see this entire landscape where it is starting to get like, next to absurd, so that's
Well,
like that.
it's absolutely, I think, in the forefront of a lot of our minds. The Zoom, I've been having no stickers on my camera now for 2 months.
Yeah.
Usually I would take the sticker off if I had to. And I think that a lot of us may be thinking about our privacy and the invasion of our privacy, yet we want access to our friends, family, heck, we want access to money, as you're just talking about this elevator pitch, and so, being able to differentiate what is important for our privacy, what is not important, and what is infiltrating our own home, that which is behind us, that, we're wearing face masks and goggles, half of us, outside every day, yet our homes are actually being invaded by the software that we're using right now. You just never know. There's a lot of thought going on in that one to hear. Thank you.
Thought.
Thought.
Yeah.
Well, I really thank you for your time. I think
you're very welcome.
That's been here tonight to listen to you speak and hear more about your practice. Next week is Glendalis Medina. We're happy to have her in our Thursday weekly series starting at 6 p.m. And with that, this will be recorded. If you miss any of or a portion of this interview / artist talk, it will be on YouTube starting probably Saturday afternoon
Awesome.
in its full form.
Wow. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. We're going to say bye now.
Bye.